The basement of Ashford College was a place few dared to enter after dark. The stone corridors were narrow, the ceilings low, and the air smelled of mildew and iron. Dust clung to every surface, and the silence was so complete that even the faintest breath seemed like a trespass. Margaret Ellison, the college archivist, descended the final steps with a torch in hand. The flame hissed and spat, casting long, restless shadows across the shelves. She had worked in these archives for nearly 2 decades, yet tonight she felt like a stranger trespassing in her own domain. The torchlight revealed rows of forgotten tomes. Their spines cracked, their titles faded. Most bore the crest of Ashford College, stamped in gold leaf. But one volume, half buried beneath a stack of ledgers, caught her eye. It was bound in black leather, darker than pitch, its surface cracked like old skin. Unlike the others, it bore no crest, no title, only a faint embossing, nearly invisible in the flickering light. She brushed away the dust and read the single word pressed into the cover. Scriptum. Margaret frowned. Her Latin was rusty, but she knew enough. Written. The book was heavier than it should have been, as though the leather binding concealed something denser than paper. She carried it to a nearby table, set the torch in its iron sconce, and opened the cover. The first pages were blank, yellowed with age. She turned them carefully, expecting brittle parchment to crumble beneath her fingers. But the paper was supple, almost warm. Then, as she turned deeper, words began to appear. At first they were faint, like ink bleeding up from beneath the page. Then they darkened, forming sentences. Margaret leaned closer, her breath catching. The words described a woman alone in the archives, torch in hand, discovering a book bound in black leather. Her pulse quickened. She turned another page. The sentences continued, describing her movements, her thoughts, even the way her hand trembled as she traced the letters. She froze. The book was writing her. The torch sputtered, shadows leaping across the walls. Margaret tried to close the volume, but the pages resisted, fluttering open again as though caught in a wind that did not exist. Her eyes darted to the text. New lines were forming, the ink bleeding across the parchment as she watched. And when she leaned closer to read, the flame of her torch. The torch hissed, then died. Darkness swallowed the room. Margaret gasped, fumbling for the book, but the air itself seemed to thicken, pressing against her chest. She heard whispers, low, rhythmic like voices chanting in a language she could not understand. The sound came not from the walls, but from the pages themselves. Her fingers brushed the parchment. It was wet, as though the ink were still fresh. She pulled her hand back, but the blackness clung to her skin, seeping into her veins like oil. The whispers grew louder. She tried to scream, but no sound left her throat. The last thing she saw, before the darkness consumed her entirely, was a single line of text burning itself into the page. The archivist is gone. The book remains. And then there was silence. Jonathan Hale had always imagined that Ashford College would be a place of promise. From the moment he stepped off the train and saw the spires rising above the misty hills of Pennsylvania, he felt a thrill of ambition. The college was old, older than most institutions in the state. Its reputation whispered about in Boston's academic circles as both prestigious and peculiar. The carriage that carried him up the winding road rattled over cobblestones, and Jonathan pressed his face to the window. The campus emerged slowly, Gothic towers of dark stone, ivy crawling like veins across their surfaces, windows glinting with a dull, watchful light. The place seemed less like a school and more like a monastery, or perhaps a fortress. At the gates, a porter greeted him with a stiff nod. "Professor Hale, I presume. The dean is expecting you." Inside, the hall smelled of wax and old wood. Portraits of past rectors lined the walls, their painted eyes following him with unnerving intensity. Jonathan adjusted his spectacles and reminded himself not to be swayed by atmosphere. He was here to teach literature, not to indulge in superstition. The dean, a tall man named Dr. Pembroke, welcomed him with a handshake that was firm but cold. "Ashford is a place of tradition," Pembroke said, his voice echoing in the vaulted office. "We value discipline, scholarship, and discretion. You will find our students eager, though sometimes impressionable." Jonathan nodded politely, though he noticed the way Pembroke's gaze lingered on him, as if weighing his worth. Later that afternoon, Jonathan wandered the campus alone. The students he passed lowered their voices when he approached, their eyes darting toward the library. The building loomed at the heart of the college, its great doors carved with Latin inscriptions. Yet one wing was sealed with heavy chains and iron locks, its windows darkened. Curious, Jonathan asked a student about it. The boy, pale and nervous, shook his head. "That wing has been closed for years, sir. Best not to ask." Then, almost in a whisper, he added, "It's where the archivist was last seen." Jonathan frowned. He had read nothing of this in the college's official correspondence. "Last seen," he pressed, but the boy had already hurried away, leaving Jonathan with more questions than answers. That evening, Jonathan settled into his new office. The room was modest, lined with shelves that smelled faintly of dust and ink. He unpacked his books, arranging them carefully, trying to shake the unease that had followed him since his arrival. As he placed the last volume on the shelf, he noticed something unusual. A folded sheet of paper slipped beneath his door. He picked it up, expecting a welcome note from a colleague. Instead, in a hand both elegant and unsettlingly precise, were the words, "The book writes what must be." Jonathan stared at the message, the torchlight flickering on his desk. He felt a chill creep up his spine. Somewhere in the depths of Ashford College, something was waiting for him, something that had already begun to write his story. Jonathan Hale's first week at Ashford College unfolded with a strange mixture of routine and unease. On the surface, everything seemed ordinary. Lectures scheduled, students filing into classrooms, the rustle of papers and the scratch of pens. Yet beneath that veneer, he sensed something unsettled, as though the college itself were holding its breath. His first lecture was on romantic poetry. He had prepared carefully, eager to impress both students and colleagues. The classroom was a vaulted chamber with tall windows that let in pale autumn light. The students sat in neat rows, their faces attentive but oddly blank, as if they were waiting for something other than his words. He began with Coleridge, reading aloud the opening lines of Kubla Khan. His voice echoed in the room, but as he spoke, he noticed several students not looking at him at all. Instead, their eyes were fixed on their notebooks. Their pens moved quickly, not copying his words, but sketching strange symbols, circles intersected by jagged lines, letters twisted into shapes that resembled no alphabet he knew. "Is there a problem?" Jonathan asked, his tone sharper than he intended. The students looked up in unison, their faces expressionless. "No, sir," one of them said softly. Then, as if nothing had happened, they returned to their notes. Jonathan forced himself to continue, but the unease lingered. When the lecture ended, he gathered his papers quickly, avoiding their eyes. Later that day, he sought refuge in the library. The great hall smelled of parchment and dust, its shelves towering like cathedral walls. He wandered between them, running his fingers along the spines of books older than the nation itself. It was there he met Professor Lydia Harrow. She was slender, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to pierce through him. "You must be the new literature professor," she said, her voice low, almost conspiratorial. "Yes, Jonathan Hale," he replied, extending his hand. She shook it briefly, then glanced around as if to ensure they were alone. "Be careful what you read here," she whispered. "Some books are not meant to be opened." Jonathan frowned. "What do you mean?" But she only smiled faintly, as though she had already said too much, and drifted away into the stacks. That night, Jonathan could not shake her words. He returned to his office, but the silence of the campus pressed heavily on him. After curfew, the corridors were deserted, the torches along the walls burning low. He decided to walk, hoping the air would clear his thoughts. As he passed the library, he noticed something strange. The chained wing, the one the student had warned him about, was not entirely dark. Through a crack in the heavy doors, a faint light flickered, as though a torch burned within. Jonathan froze. The wing was supposed to be sealed, abandoned for years. He stepped closer, straining to hear. A murmur reached his ears, low voices, chanting in rhythm. He pressed his hand against the cold iron chain, but it held firm. Whoever was inside had not entered through the main doors. A chill ran down his spine. He turned quickly and hurried back to his office, telling himself it was none of his concern. Yet the image of that flickering light haunted him. When he reached his office, he found the door slightly ajar. He was certain he had locked it. Heart pounding, he pushed it open. The room was empty, but on his desk lay a single sheet of paper. He approached cautiously. The page was blank at first. Then, before his eyes, ink began to spread across it. forming words in a hand both elegant and unsettlingly precise. He walks the halls after curfew. He sees what he should not see. He will not sleep tonight. Jonathan staggered back, the torchlight quivering on the walls. The words were still wet, glistening as though freshly written. He touched the edge of the page, and the ink smeared onto his fingers, black and cold. A sound broke the silence, a whisper just behind him. He spun around, but the room was empty. Only the shadows moved, stretching long and thin across the floor. Jonathan forced himself to breathe. He folded the paper, slipped it into his coat pocket, and sat heavily at his desk. His rational mind screamed for explanation. A prank, a trick, some elaborate initiation for new faculty. But deep inside, he knew better. The book, the note he had found on his first night, the symbols in the students' notebooks, the light in the forbidden wing. It was all connected, and Ashford College was not merely a place of learning. It was something else entirely, a place where words themselves had power, where writing could shape reality. Jonathan extinguished his torch and sat in the darkness, the folded paper burning like a brand against his chest. He did not sleep that night. Jonathan Hale had never considered himself a man prone to paranoia. Yet Ashford College was beginning to erode his confidence in reason. The note that had appeared on his desk still weighed heavily in his pocket, its words etched into his mind. He told himself it was a prank, some elaborate initiation for new faculty, but the memory of the ink forming before his eyes refused to fade. On the third evening of his tenure, Jonathan lingered in the faculty lounge after supper. The room was dim, lit only by a few torches along the paneled walls. He sat alone, pretending to read, when two professors entered. They did not notice him in the shadows. Their voices were hushed, but the silence of the lounge carried every word. "The circle meets tonight," one said. Jonathan recognized him as Professor Alden, who taught philosophy. "The dean insists we proceed," replied the other, a woman whose voice he could not place. "The manuscript must be fed." Jonathan's pulse quickened. He leaned forward, straining to hear more, but the pair moved toward the door, their words dissolving into whispers. "The circle, the manuscript." He waited until they were gone, then rose quickly, his heart pounding. He had no plan, only a gnawing need to know the truth. That night, long after curfew, Jonathan left his office and crept through the silent corridors. The torches burned low, their flames sputtering in the draft. He moved carefully, his footsteps muffled against the stone floor. The library loomed ahead, its chained wing dark and silent. But as he drew closer, he noticed a faint glow seeping through the cracks of a side door. He pressed his ear against the wood. Voices murmured within, low and rhythmic, like a chant. Jonathan's hand trembled as he pushed gently. To his surprise, the door gave way. Beyond it lay a narrow passage, hidden behind the shelves. He slipped inside, the air growing colder as he descended a spiral staircase. At the bottom, he found himself in a chamber lit by torches set into the walls. The room was circular, its stone floor etched with symbols that seemed to writhe in the flickering light. Around the circle stood half a dozen figures, professors and students alike. At the center, on a pedestal of black wood, lay a book. Its cover was bound in cracked leather, its edges darkened as if burned. Jonathan knew at once what it was, the manuscript. One of the students stepped forward, a pale boy with hollow eyes. He held a blank sheet of parchment in trembling hands. At a nod from Professor Alden, the boy began to read aloud from the manuscript. The words were in no language Jonathan recognized, yet they filled the chamber with a resonance that made his bones ache. As the boy spoke, the blank parchment in his hands began to darken. Lines of text appeared, mirroring the words he read, as though the page itself were bleeding ink. Jonathan's breath caught. He watched as reality seemed to bend around the ritual. The torches flared brighter, shadows lengthened, and the air grew heavy with the scent of iron and ash. The professors stood in silence, their faces solemn, their eyes fixed on the boy. When he finished, the parchment was no longer blank, but filled with dense, black script. He handed it to Alden, who folded it carefully and placed it in a chest at the edge of the circle. Jonathan's mind reeled. This was no superstition, no trick of the eye. The manuscript was alive, a mechanism of power that could inscribe reality itself. He stepped back, his foot scraping against the stone. The sound echoed in the chamber. Every head turned. For a moment, silence reigned. Then Alden's eyes locked on his, cold and unblinking. A faint smile curved the professor's lips. "Our guest has arrived," Alden said softly. The others turned fully toward Jonathan. Their faces were calm, almost welcoming, but their eyes gleamed with something darker: possession, hunger, inevitability. Jonathan's throat went dry. He wanted to run, but his legs refused to move. The manuscript lay open on the pedestal, its pages fluttering as though stirred by an unseen wind. Alden gestured toward him. "Do not be afraid, Professor Hale. The circle has been waiting for you." Jonathan's heart hammered in his chest. He forced himself to speak, though his voice shook. "What is this? What are you doing?" Alden's smile widened. "We are shaping truth, writing the world as it must be. And now, you'll help us." The torches flared, casting the chamber in blinding light. Jonathan shielded his eyes, but when he lowered his hand, he saw that the manuscript's pages were no longer blank. They bore his name: Jonathan Hale enters the circle. The words glistened, wet with fresh ink. Jonathan staggered back, but the circle of figures closed around him. The manuscript pulsed on the pedestal, its pages turning as though eager to write the next line. And Jonathan realized, with a chill that froze his blood, that he was no longer merely an observer. He was a character in the story the book was writing. Jonathan Hale tried to convince himself that what he had seen in the hidden chamber was nothing more than a fever dream. He told himself that exhaustion, the strangeness of his new surroundings, and the weight of expectation had conjured illusions. Yet when he awoke the next morning, the folded sheet of paper still lay on his desk, its words etched in black. Jonathan Hale enters the circle. He burned it in the torch flame, but the words remained in his mind, seared into memory. Classes resumed, and Jonathan forced himself into routine. He lectured on Shelley and Byron, trying to lose himself in the rhythm of poetry. But the students unsettled him. Their eyes followed him too intently, as though they were not listening to his words, but to something beneath them. And when he glanced at their notebooks, his stomach tightened. They were not taking notes on the lecture. They were writing symbols again, circles, jagged lines, twisted letters. Some pages were filled with nothing but repetitions of a single phrase. The book writes what must be. Jonathan slammed his hand on one desk. "What is this nonsense?" he demanded. The student looked up, startled, but said nothing. The others stared at him with blank expressions, as though he had broken some unspoken rule. That night, Jonathan returned to his office, determined to put his thoughts in order. He opened his notebook, intending to draft the next day's lecture. But when he dipped his pen and set it to paper, the words that appeared were not his own. The professor cannot escape. The words are already inside him. Jonathan dropped the pen. His breath came fast, his hands trembling. He turned the page, hoping to find a blank sheet, but the ink bled upward from the parchment itself, forming sentences without his touch. He reads what he has not written. He writes what he has not thought. Jonathan slammed the notebook shut. His rational mind screamed for explanation. Ink bleeding from dampness, some chemical reaction, a trick of the eye. But deep down, he knew the truth. The manuscript's contagion had spread to him. The following day, he sought out Professor Lydia Harrow. She was in the library, her arms full of ancient tomes. When she saw him, her expression hardened. "You've seen it," she said quietly. Jonathan nodded. "The circle, the manuscript, it's real." Lydia glanced around to ensure they were alone. "I warned you. Once you've read its words, once you've seen them written, you are marked. The writing spreads. It seeps into your thoughts, your speech, your very hand. You cannot stop it." Jonathan's voice shook. "Then what am I supposed to do?" She lowered her gaze. "Survive. Few do." That night, Jonathan tried to write a letter to his sister in Boston. He wanted to reassure himself that he was still in control, that he could still form his own words. But as his pen moved, the sentences twisted. "The sister will never read this. The letter is not his to write." Jonathan tore the page to shreds, his heart hammering. He tried again, but the same thing happened. Each attempt ended with words he had not chosen, thoughts he had not formed. By midnight, his desk was littered with ruined pages. He buried his face in his hands, despair gnawing at him. Then he heard it, the faint scratch of a pen. He lifted his head. On the desk before him lay a single sheet of parchment. His pen moved across it, though he had not touched it. The nib scratched furiously, ink spilling in elegant strokes. Jonathan watched in horror as the page filled with words. His thoughts, his fears, his memories. It described the moment he had first stepped onto the campus, the unease he had felt, the terror in the hidden chamber. It described his sleepless nights, his trembling hands, his desperate attempts to resist. And then it went further. He will betray himself. He will betray them all. Jonathan seized the pen, tried to wrench it away, but the ink continued to flow as though the page itself were alive. He hurled the parchment into the fire, but even as it burned, the words etched themselves into his mind. He staggered back, clutching his head. The whispers returned, low and insistent, echoing in the corners of the room. They spoke in no language he knew, yet he understood them all the same. Right, right, right. Jonathan collapsed into his chair, his body trembling. He realized with a sickening certainty that the manuscript was no longer confined to the circle, no longer locked in the forbidden wing. It was inside him now, bleeding into his thoughts, his words, his very identity. And there was no escape. Jonathan Hale could no longer pretend that the manuscript's influence was a passing madness. It had seeped into his notebooks, his letters, even his thoughts. Every attempt to resist only seemed to draw him deeper. He knew now that avoidance was impossible. If he was to survive, he had to face the source directly. On a moonless night, he left his office and crossed the silent quadrangle. The torches along the walls sputtered in the wind, their flames bending like reeds. The library loomed ahead, its chained wing dark and forbidding. Jonathan's heart pounded as he approached, but he forced himself onward. The side passage he had discovered before was unguarded. He slipped inside, descending the spiral staircase into the hidden chamber. The air grew colder with each step, heavy with the scent of ash and ink. When he reached the bottom, the circle was already assembled. Professors and students stood in a ring, their faces lit by the wavering torchlight. At the center, on its black pedestal, lay the manuscript. Its pages fluttered though no wind stirred. This time, it was not a student who read, but Professor Alden himself. His voice was low and resonant, filling the chamber with a cadence that made Jonathan's skin crawl. The words he spoke were not in English, yet Jonathan understood them all the same. They described events, not yet happened, fires that would burn, voices that would fall silent, choices that would be made. Jonathan realized with horror that Alden was not recounting the past, but inscribing the future. The manuscript was not merely a record. It was a prophecy, a script that reality itself obeyed. "Stop this," Jonathan said, his voice echoing in the chamber. The circle turned toward him. Alden closed the book slowly, his eyes gleaming. "Professor Hale," he said with a smile, "you return to us. The manuscript has chosen you." "I want no part of this," Jonathan snapped. "You're enslaving yourselves to a book. You're letting it dictate your lives." A murmur rippled through the circle, half amusement, half pity. Alden stepped forward. "You misunderstand. We are not enslaved. We are authors. The manuscript is the instrument, and we are the hand that guides it." Jonathan shook his head. "No, it writes you. I've seen it. It writes me. None of us are in control." Alden's smile widened. "Control is an illusion, Professor. The book writes what must be. We are merely fortunate enough to glimpse the design." Jonathan's anger flared. He strode toward the pedestal, his eyes fixed on the manuscript. "Then I'll end it." Gasps rose from the circle as he seized the book. The leather was warm beneath his hands, pulsing faintly like living flesh. He hurled it toward the fire pit at the center of the chamber. The flames leapt high, engulfing the volume. For a moment, hope surged in him, but then the fire sputtered, dimmed, and died. The torches along the walls flickered out one by one, plunging the chamber into darkness. When the light returned, the manuscript lay unharmed on the pedestal, its pages unburned. Slowly, they turned of their own accord, settling on a blank sheet. Ink bled upward, forming words. Jonathan leaned closer despite himself. He tries to destroy the book. He fails. He reads these words as they are written. Jonathan staggered back, his breath ragged. The circle watched in silence, their faces serene, as though this outcome had been inevitable. "No," Jonathan whispered. "This isn't real. I still have a choice." The manuscript's pages turned again. More words appeared, darker, sharper. He tells himself he has a choice. He does not. Jonathan's vision swam. He clutched his head, trying to block out the words, but they echoed inside his skull. He could feel the book writing him, line by line, thought by thought. Desperate, he drew a dagger from his coat, a relic he had carried since his student days, more symbolic than practical. With a cry, he slashed at the pages. The blade cut deep, tearing through parchment. For an instant, the chamber shook, the torches flaring wildly. The circle cried out in alarm. Jonathan pressed harder, ripping the book apart. But even as he tore the pages, they healed. The ink bled across the wounds, stitching them closed. The parchment reformed beneath his hands, whole once more. And then the writing changed. It was no longer in the third person. I strike at the book. I fail. I am written as I write these words. Jonathan froze. The manuscript was no longer describing him. It was speaking as him. His own thoughts, his own actions were being inscribed in the first person. He dropped the dagger, his hands trembling. The circle closed in around him, their eyes shining with reverence. "Do you see now?" Alden asked softly. "The book is not separate from you. It is you. You are its voice." Jonathan shook his head violently. "No, I won't be your scribe. I won't let it consume me." But even as he spoke, the manuscript's pages turned again. The words appeared faster now, racing across the parchment. Jonathan felt them forming in his mind before he could resist. "I deny it. I resist. But the words are already mine." He fell to his knees, clutching his head, the whispers rising to a deafening roar. The circle stood in silence, watching as the book claimed him. And Jonathan realized, with a despair deeper than any he had known, that he was no longer merely a character in the manuscript. He was its narrator. Jonathan Hale stood at the threshold of the hidden chamber once more, his body trembling with exhaustion and dread. The circle had summoned him, though no words were spoken. He had felt the call in his mind, a pressure behind his eyes, a whisper that was not his own. He knew he could not refuse. The chamber was brighter than before, torches blazing in their sconces, shadows writhing across the stone walls. The circle stood in silence, their faces serene, their eyes fixed on the pedestal at the center. Upon it lay the manuscript, its pages fluttering as though stirred by an invisible wind. Professor Alden stepped forward. "It is time," he said softly. "The book has chosen its narrator." Jonathan's throat was dry. He wanted to speak, to protest, but the words formed in his mind before he could shape them. He felt them pressing against his lips, demanding release. "I enter the chamber. I hear Alden's voice. I cannot resist." The words appeared on the manuscript's pages even as he thought them. Jonathan staggered back, horrified. His thoughts were no longer his own. They were sentences inscribed in real time. "No," he whispered. "I won't do this." But the book wrote anyway. "I say I will not do this. Yet I already have." The circle watched in reverent silence. To them, this was not horror, but fulfillment. Jonathan felt their expectation pressing down on him, suffocating. Then a voice cut through the silence. "Jonathan." He turned. Lydia Harrow stood at the edge of the circle, her face pale but resolute. She had not been there before. He had not seen her enter. Yet the manuscript's pages turned, and her presence was already written. "You don't have to give in," she said. "I know what it feels like. I was chosen once, long ago. I escaped." Jonathan's heart lurched. Ow! Her eyes burned with urgency. By refusing the words, by refusing thought itself. The book feeds on language. If you deny it language, it starves. Alden's voice thundered across the chamber. "Lies. She is a deserter, a coward. The book cannot be denied. It writes what must be." But Jonathan clung to Lydia's words. He felt the manuscript tugging at his mind, pulling his thoughts and his sentences into lines of ink. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to silence. The manuscript's pages fluttered violently. He closes his eyes. He tries to resist. He cannot. Jonathan clenched his fists. He slowed his breathing, emptying his mind. No words, no sentences, only silence. The whispers rose around him, furious, insistent. "Right, right, right." The circle began to chant, their voices merging with the whispers, pressing against him like a tide. But Jonathan held on. He pictured darkness, emptiness, a void without language. He refused to think in words. He refused to narrate. The manuscript faltered. Its pages stilled. For the first time, no ink appeared. Alden's face twisted in rage. "You cannot stop it. You are the book." Jonathan opened his eyes. The circle loomed around him, their chants faltering. The manuscript lay open, blank, its power suspended. Lydia stepped forward. "You see? It hesitates. It cannot write without you." Jonathan felt a surge of strength. He placed his hands on the manuscript, not to destroy it, but to still it. He poured his silence into it, his refusal to narrate. The pages trembled, then lay still. The chamber shook. The torches flared, then guttered. The circle cried out, their voices breaking. One by one, they collapsed, their connections severed. Alden staggered forward, his eyes wild. "You fool! Without the book, there is nothing. You will be nothing." Jonathan met his gaze. "Better nothing than a story I did not choose." The manuscript shuddered beneath his hands. Then, slowly, its pages turned blank, one after another, until the entire volume was empty. The whispers ceased. The chamber fell silent. Jonathan released the book. It lay still, lifeless, no more than leather and parchment. The circle was gone. Whether they had fled or dissolved, he did not know. Only Lydia remained, her face weary but relieved. "You did it," she whispered. Jonathan shook his head. "No, I only refused." Together, they climbed the spiral staircase, leaving the chamber behind. The torches above burned low, their flames ordinary, their shadows still. For the first time since his arrival, Jonathan felt the weight lift from his chest. Yet he knew the silence would not last. The manuscript had been stilled, not destroyed. Its pages were blank, but blankness was only potential. And somewhere, in the depths of his mind, he felt the faintest echo of words waiting to be written. The autumn sun rose pale over Ashford College, gilding the ivy-covered towers in a light that seemed too gentle for what had transpired beneath them. Students hurried across the quadrangle, their laughter echoing against the stone, as though the world had returned to its ordinary rhythm. Jonathan Hale walked among them, but he felt no part of their world. His steps were heavy, his eyes shadowed. He had survived the chamber, survived the circle, survived the book itself. Yet survival did not feel like victory. In his office, the shelves stood as they always had, lined with volumes of poetry and prose. The air smelled of ink and dust, familiar and comforting. But Jonathan no longer trusted the written word. Each page seemed a trap, each sentence a snare. He touched his books with hesitation, as though they might awaken beneath his hand. Lydia Harrow visited him often in those days. She spoke little, but her presence steadied him. One afternoon, as the light slanted through the tall windows, she said quietly, "The silence will not last forever. The manuscript waits. It always waits." Jonathan nodded. He had known it already. The book had not been destroyed, only stilled. Its pages were blank, but blankness was not emptiness. It was potential. That night, alone in his office, Jonathan sat before a fresh notebook. The cover was plain, the pages crisp and white. He opened it slowly, his pen poised above the first sheet. His hand trembled. He wanted to write, not for the circle, not for the manuscript, but for himself, for the love of words that had once defined his life. Yet, as the nib hovered, he felt the weight of silence pressing down on him. He remembered the whispers, the ink that had bled from nothing, the sentences that had stolen his thoughts. He closed the notebook. The torch on his desk flickered, casting long shadows across the room. Jonathan leaned back, forcing himself to breathe. He would not write. Not tonight. Perhaps not ever again. But as he extinguished the flame and prepared to leave, he noticed something on the desk. A single sheet of paper lay where none had been before. Its surface was white, untouched. Yet in the wavering light, he thought he saw the faintest shimmer of ink, like words struggling to emerge. He bent closer. The page remained blank. Only his reflection stared back from the darkened window. Jonathan closed his eyes. He told himself it was nothing, only a trick of the light. He left the office, locking the door behind him. The paper lay in silence, and in that silence, the faintest shadow of a sentence lingered, waiting to be written.